Whoops. Welcome, everybody. This is the July 14th meeting of the Conejo Open Space Conservation Agency. Please join me in the salute to the flag.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. May we have the roll call, please?
Director Bill de la Pena, absent. Vice Chair Gibson.
Here.
Director Jacobson.
Here.
Director Fox, absent. Chair Skay.
Present. Thank you. I don't have any public comment cards for under just.
I could make a comment.
Oh, certainly.
This is probably the appropriate time, and I just wanted to acknowledge that we're coming up on a very distinguished event here in the Conejo Valley, and that is the 50th wedding anniversary of Mark and Doreen Jacobson.
Congratulations. She's a saint. Okay, that's wonderful. Congratulations, Mark. Let's go on to committee reports and announcements. Are there any committee reports? Not tonight. Consent calendar, the minutes of May 12th. This was a meeting I missed. Any comments or corrections to the May 12th minutes?
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. All the minutes are approved. New items. Under 6A, we have the approval of the Conejo Canyons Open Space Management Plan and the associated mitigated negative declaration. We do have one speaker card for this, but Ms. Austin, would you give our staff report, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to direct the board's attention to the PowerPoint. Just to refresh your memory, the Conejo Canyons plan area is located in the northwest section of the city of Thousand Oaks, and it's outlined in black here. In 2007, Cosca received a technical assistance grant from the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program for preparation of the Conejo Canyons Open Space Management Plan. On January 13th of this year, the Cosca Board approved the draft management plan and authorized staff to initiate the environmental review process. Staff made some minor changes to the draft management plan based on board comments at the January 13th meeting. Issue number 4, trail accessibility for persons using assistive mobility devices, was added to the Trails and Emergency Access section on page 5-9 of the management plan. Action item 8 on page 5-10 of the management plan was added to initiate the Universal Trail Assessment Process, or UTAP, for new and existing trails and provide resulting information at trail entry points and on the Cosca website. Also, the CRPD master plan was added to the list of management plan policy foundation documents, and that addition appears on pages 3-7 and 3-8 of the management plan. The revised Trails and Emergency Access section, again on pages 5-9 and 5-10, highlights Cosca's commitment to installing trail entry structures that allow more convenient access by people using assistive mobility devices, gathering and providing trail accessibility information, and optimizing accessibility of the new proposed trail across Conejo Creek from the Hill Canyon Access Road. And here is the figure showing the existing and proposed trails, and it's kind of hard to decipher but on this exhibit, but it's actually on page 4-25 of the management plan, and this just shows the new trail across the Conejo Creek in pink, and it's near the northern boundary of the management plan area. An initial study was conducted and determined that a mitigated negative declaration was the appropriate environmental document to prepare. because the possible minor environmental impacts from implementation of the Conejo Canyons Management Plan can be mitigated. The draft MND was prepared by staff, and the 21-day public review period took place from April 2nd to April 23rd. One comment letter was received, but no new environmental issues were raised in that letter. And in conclusion, approval of the final management plan and MND are important steps towards ensuring protection of this unique area and providing environmentally sensitive, sustainable public access and land stewardship. Staff recommends approval of the Conejo Canyons Open Space Management Plan and the associated mitigated negative declaration. And there's one more slide, actually, if we could bring it up. I would like to extend a special thanks again to Ann Dove and the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program for all of their help in developing and completing this management plan. They helped us throughout the process, just completed helping us last week, in fact. So just wanted to say thanks again to them for all their assistance. And staff is available for questions, and Greg Smith, the environmental planner who prepared the MND, is also here to answer questions about that document. Thank you.
Any questions of staff? Mr. Gibson.
Yeah, just a couple questions on the MND. Greg, I guess these go to you. I do see that we identified several impacts that could be significant, but they can all be reduced to less than significant one mitigation. I got a couple of questions, though, with the appropriateness of a couple of mitigation measures. Specifically, the first one I have is dealing with air quality on page 10. And we're talking about fugitive dust here. And it suggests that to stabilize dust, polymers could be used to do that. Is that appropriate in open space areas, or are we talking areas that would not be open space?
Well, again, the polymers are kind of desirable from the standpoint of APCD because, you know, they're water soluble. They don't necessarily contaminate the environment. They stay on site. This is a typical mitigation measure that we would identify for other projects where the ground surface is either temporarily or permanently disturbed. If for some reason the Cosca board would like to remove this for some reason, we can certainly do that. This is
well, my only concern with that is, I mean, if they're water soluble and they're environmentally sensitive, I wouldn't want to be looking at using any sort of chemical treatment in the open space areas that wouldn't meet. So I mean, if there's issues or concerns that we're looking at, that's really my concern.
Sure. So. Well, they certainly, you know, we can certainly strike that mitigation measure. You know, it's one of the recommended mitigation measures provided by APCD. Right. But in this case, if you feel that you'd rather remove that, we can certainly do that.
You know, because I don't think the areas that we're talking about would be that large. I mean, we're
probably not
small areas, trailheads, maybe some parking areas.
Right.
So the amount of time we'd be in there doing disturbance. I mean, the other provisions we have in here, you know, I think would be adequate, you know, to keep dust down.
Sure.
You know, and again, it's not like we would be grading 10 acres, or where we could have a lot of open area subject to dust control. So,
sure.
You know, if that's appropriate, I would make that suggestion that we maybe strike item 1 on the mitigation and
right.
Or just leave it as water, you know.
Or water, yeah.
You know, just use typical.
Remove the approved polymers.
Sure. And what we can do is we can make that clear in the mitigation monitoring plan, which is a draft and subject to revision by the lead agency, in this case Cosca. We can make that a final document and just make it clear that just delete that reference, and we can do that, no problem.
The second question I have is on the next page with regards to biological resources. Again, we found this to be significant with mitigation, and the mitigation that we're looking at here deals with potential impacts to sensitive species, should we have any. And I guess I'm a little concerned is that it says in the event avoidance is infeasible, restoration or in-kind replacement of suitable habitat on site would be required. If we can't minimize it, how are we going to do on-site restoration? I guess I'm a little confused.
Well, there are a number of areas, of course, as you know, that have been colonized by non-native species. We did a very thorough analysis of the plan and the trail alignments and other facilities that were proposed here, and we're not anticipating any impacts. But like in a dynamic environment where sensitive species, some of them which actually thrive in some kind of disturbance conditions,
right,
can suddenly show up, and we would be then in a situation where we would have to mitigate. This is a kind of a standard wording of a condition that would identify how we would go about doing that. We're confident that we're not impacting these species, but because we have things like Astragalus brontanii that could conceivably show up sometime, this is a kind of a standard language where we would attempt to either relocate that plant or, in the case of another species, attempt to reestablish some habitat if some kind of minor effect occurred, but we're not anticipating that.
If that would occur, could we, modify this to say that basically we would do it in areas where there's non-natives or invasives?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
That way, then we're really talking about, I think, that something is really habitat enhancement at that point in time, as opposed to leaving it sort of blanket here that, hey, we'll just do it on site, and well, that's great, but if we can do it in conjunction with removing non-natives or invasives, then I think your point's...
Well, we can certainly do that again, and I think it would be appropriate to provide the proper language in the mitigation monitoring program, because all of these mitigation measures are addressed in that document. We can provide that clarification there. That way we don't have to amend the final M&D, but only the mitigation monitoring plan, which is very specific, includes the same wording. So if you'd like, we can make those changes as well.
That would be my suggestion, if we could do that. And then I don't have any other questions or comments, but if those are satisfactory, then I would suggest that we move staff recommendation with the modification suggested.
We do have a speaker card.
We have
too,
a speaker
so,
card? All right, then I'll hold on
if
to
you'd
the
hold that for a
motion.
moment. Any other questions to staff? Director Jacobson?
I was pleased to see that we minimally had any impacts, less than significant impact or less than significant with mitigation. Most of them were no impact, and therefore the potential cost, either short-term or long-term, would presumably be minimal. But I am always concerned about the budgetary impact of complying with and attempting to satisfy all the conditions which are identified as maybe a budget expenditure in the long run. As a part of the study, do you ever take a look at whether or not the budgetary impact should be considered because of the limited capabilities of these two agencies to possibly meet all the requirements for the declaration?
Well, under the California Environmental Quality Act guidelines, they've been pretty specific in saying we have to focus our attention on physical changes to the environment and those economic aspects, which are certainly impacts in terms of being able to fund, the improvements and mitigation required as a part of the plan. That's a separate issue. We don't normally deal with it as a part of the environmental document.
I realize that, but I was wondering if they enter into any consideration in the weighting of the action that is to be taken. For example, as an alternative on the polymer stabilizer that you contrasted, why did that pop up just because there's been concern of Director Gibson instead of an alternative approach.
Well,
I think
yeah.
indicated that those are not long-lasting, that they are either dissolved by water or would disappear after maybe 1 or 2 years of application.
Typically, we do consider things in terms of their overall feasibility, whether they've been successfully used in the past, things that are obviously exceedingly expensive. If we can find something that has worked and is capable of avoiding or eliminating an impact, that is a consideration in terms of identifying those issues. We don't necessarily provide an impact analysis in terms of the cost-benefit ratio, but we're trying to be consistent here with the way we've looked at all other projects involved with these kinds of effects, and we identified mitigation measures that we are confident will reduce or avoid those effects. And in most cases, I feel confident that the things that we've identified here are reasonable, they are feasible, they're not excessively expensive. Again, as you pointed out, Mr. Jacobson, there are very few impacts associated with this management plan. In fact, we've kind of tiered our analysis here to identify the majority of management issues here are actually categorically exempt. They don't require any mitigation. They don't involve any direct impact on the environment. They're really intended to manage the environment in a way that has little or no effect. And so there are very few mitigation measures here, very few impacts, and overall the costs associated with those mitigation measures in most cases is fairly negligible.
Fine. Well, I appreciate the effort and the work that went into this preparation, and as a follow-up effort, I'm sure we'll be seeing potential budgetary impacts on enhancement of our trails and the mitigation measures that will be undertaken.
Well, just with one caveat, as we've indicated, there may or may not be other impacts that are speculative in nature, and we haven't identified mitigation measures for some of those items. But in general, the plan has really negligible impacts in terms of the cost of mitigation.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, Mark Langston, Caneo Open Space Trails Advisory Committee Chairperson. I would like to first say that we as an organization and a committee are appreciative of the steps that have been taken to involve the community in the process. This process, as a lot of people know, is a lot longer than a lot of people know about, and we're excited to see that this is hopefully going to result in a large addition to our open space. COSTAC as an organization is in favor of the MND, and we would like to also point out and obviously make ourselves available from the community standpoint that whatever needs to be done to move the process forward, we are available. So, and again, thank you for the process that took place involving the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Langton. Board, what's your pleasure? Mr. Gibson.
All right, I'll revisit it now. I would move the recommendation to approve the Caneo Canyons Open Space Management Plan and the associated mitigated negative declaration as we have modified it here this evening.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Discussion? I will just give my little sort of historical personal observation. You know, the city really made a big step back in the 70s. I think it was 1976 when the planning department, and John was involved with that, and I think Dave Davis was the lead planner at that. I think Greg was involved too, as I remember. Maybe you're too young for that. But they commissioned the Arroyo Caneo Canyon study, which really did set out, this is a tremendous resource for the Caneo Valley that had been kind of forgotten, abused, had a lot of other ownerships, jurisdictions. It was out of sight, and a lot of bad things were happening. And, it was also and still is, a major infrastructure conduit. We have the sewage trunk lines that go down there and then down to the Hill Canyon Treatment Plant. But that canyon study back in the 70s really was almost a catalyst for the formation of this agency, the Caney Open Space Conservation Agency, and a lot of good things have happened. So this is an outstanding plan. I'm really, really appreciative of staff putting so much time and effort into it, and of course to the Rivers and Trails Assistance Program as well. So I will certainly support the motion. Mr. Gibson.
If I can make just one comment, this kind of takes me back to sort of my first role on the Park District when we had the Hill Canyon golf course project, and I remember that thing, my first vote was then. So I think this is a much better use of this property than a golf course. Not that I don't like golf, but I think this is a much better use. So.
Okay. Any other comments on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any abstentions or opposition? No. Motion passes, and thank you all very much. So our next item is the resolution to approve an application to the National Park Service for Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program for technical assistance to prepare a strategic plan for Cosca. So we're really getting our paperwork in order, huh?
Trying.
Ms. Austin, is this your item too?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to direct your attention again to the PowerPoint. Thank you. As you know, Cosca was formed through a joint exercise of powers agreement between the city and CRPD in October 1977. Cosca's establishing resolution defines the agency's purposes as acquiring, controlling, managing, conserving, and preserving open space, and coordinating planning efforts and land use policies for open space. Since CRPD's formation in 1963 and the city's incorporation in 1964, approximately 15,000 acres of open space have been preserved. Cosca manages approximately 12,500 acres of open space and 140 miles of multi-use trails. Since almost all of the large plots of land in the city have either been preserved as open space or developed, Cosca is transitioning its focus from open space acquisition to open space management. It has been over 20 years since Cosca last updated or adopted an agency-wide policy and management document. Staff believes it is time to develop a strategic plan for Cosca. Agencies use strategic planning to examine big picture goals and develop targeted actions and strategies for achieving their goals. Through development of a strategic plan, Cosca will assess the present state of the agency operations and infrastructure, develop a mission statement, articulate a vision for the agency's future, clarify organizational goals, and develop strategies to achieve the agency's mission, vision, and goals. To prepare Cosca's strategic plan, staff is requesting approval to apply to the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program for technical assistance. As you just heard, Cosca recently completed a successful partnership with RTCA in the development of the Conejo Canyons Management Plan. RTCA provides support and expertise in planning, coordination, facilitation, and public involvement. Staff recommends that the Cosca Board adopt Resolution Number 2010-3 to approve the application to the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program. And I'm available for questions. Thank you.
Questions of Ms. Austin? Mr. Gibson.
Yeah, I think this is a very good idea, Brad. I guess sort of my question is, going after the grant is one thing, and whether we get it, I think we should proceed with the strategic plan process one way or the other. What does staff envision as the process, the role of the board, the role of the staff, the role of the public?
Well, we haven't actually gone through this process before, so it'll sort of be initially learning the process, working with the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance. program to learn what they've done with other agencies, and obviously reviewing CRPD's new strategic plan, and then having the board and the public very involved, getting their feedback as to what they think the mission and vision for Cosca should be.
Yeah, because I mean, having just been through this with our board, this is something that I really believe, and I'd like to hear what Mark and Rory has to say, as well as Claudia and Andy, if they could weigh in. This is something that should be board driven. This becomes sort of at a strategy level, almost a policy level type document. This is not a tactical, how do we do it, but this is where are we going and what are we going to do. So, and I don't know if Jim or John have any thoughts in that process or not, but I would be, very interested in seeing this as sort of needs to be board driven, and also have a large opportunity for the public, COSTAC, and others to play a role. So.
Okay. Mr. Prescott, did you have a comment?
No, I think I agree with that very much. The strategic plans really look at the long-range future of an organization. They look at the resources that the organization may have available or not have available in the future. They look at what the real purpose of that agency is and how to get that done, and actually what should be done. There are always more things you want to do than you have the resources available, so it does help focus the organization. Strategic plans, also the strategic planning process, I think Jim or the two CRPD board members could elaborate on this quite effectively. They're great communication tools to get all of the people that are involved with the mission of the organization, what it's all about, why it's there, what it wants to get done, how it can most effectively get that done. You get them all talking to each other and sharing ideas and sharing their own individual perspectives about all of those topics, and you wind up with really a more cohesive organization and one better prepared to move forward. And having in the board's case, obviously the elected leadership really buy into that, and in this case, you're all electeds except Rory, but you're appointed. Buying into that and giving the staff the authority to move forward to carry out something that the board's all agreed to is invaluable.
Mr. Friedel, do you have anything else to?
No, I think what I would add to what Mr. Prescott said, and I agree thoroughly with it, is that it is in fact a policy level document. Trying to get this board to commit the kind of time that it takes is a challenge, because these folks here are extremely busy, and this is one of many boards that they're on. But at some point, what we'll probably recommend, and certainly work with the National Park Service, is that we do some series of public outreach meetings with the public and come back to the board with sort of those preliminary findings, what the public's kind of saying, and then maybe have the board kick around what they're hearing from the public, what they think themselves, what staff has to, report, synthesize all that, and then put it into a document and go out yet again to the public and say, here's where the board's coming from on the strategic planning items. So it would be an extremely comprehensive public outreach process to do it well.
And interactive. And I could see it going the other way too, that we have maybe a board workshop or retreat with the assisted Rivers and Trails moderating, and kind of see what we think things are now, and then go out to the public and have, but you're right, it should be very interactive. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not going to be here's a draft document, we approve it, there you go. It's going to have a lot more input from all of us. Mr. Jacobson?
What you, as chairperson, identified is really the mechanism by which the Park District established its strategic plan, and on every action that is brought before the board, it is reviewed with respect to compliance and enhancement of the specific plan for the district. I think this is an appropriate step for Cosca, and I guess I have a question because I don't know the answer to this. does the city have a strategic plan which it uses as a mechanism for guiding its actions?
The city does have a strategic plan. It's the financial strategic plan. And that was developed originally about 10 years ago. And it did make projections as to revenues and expenditures, looking at all of the trends that we could foresee at that time. And that particular tool has been very, very valuable as the city has gone through, particularly the last 2 or 3 budget cycles where we had significant drop-offs in revenues. Part of that was actually something that was foreseen years ago in the diminishing revenue associated with development projects, and that led the city to be able to take steps earlier than we otherwise would have.
Okay. Mr. Gibson?
Basis, I feel strongly if this is an action that should be supported and funding should be requested, and to that end, if there are no other comments.
If there are no other comments, I would ask, yes. Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Gibson?
Yeah, if I could, and then I'll defer back to Mr. Jacobson. I see this also because we've talked to our park district about the need to visit with the city updating the conservation element of the general plan, which I think, in a larger sense is a strategic plan as well, of sense. And because we've talked about that a couple of times as to having the need to revisit that from our standpoint, because we use that sort of as our master plan as well. And I think in doing that, this becomes a critical step in understanding how all the pieces within both the city and the park district's vision fits together, and I think allows us, if we can get this part done, then maybe to work with the city in updating the conservation element after that. So having our strategic plan in place, having this strategic plan, I know the city regularly goes through a general plan update as they're required, but I think, John, it's been a few years since the conservation element was really revisited comprehensively.
That being the case, I would like to make a motion that the board adopt resolution number 2010-3, and if the procedure is similar to that we follow on the Caneo Recreation and Park District Board of Directors, that the title be read and that the resolution be read in title only, and that all further readings be waived.
Need a second?
Second.
All right. Any other discussion on the motion? And I will just point out, this is the recommendation is to apply, and we would still have, assuming that the application is accepted and the grant is given, we as a board and staff still have time to shape what we want that grant to accomplish. Correct?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. If no other comments on the motion, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposition or abstention? No. Motion passes. Thank you very much. Let's see, for item 7, we have the status report on trail accessibility and planning. Kristen, we also have a comment card on this, but Kristen, would you please give the staff report?
Thank you, Chair Skay, and good evening, members of the board. Can I direct your attention to the PowerPoint, please? Thank you. I'll begin with an update on the status of outdoor area accessibility guidelines. In October of 2009, the U.S. Access Board released its draft final accessibility guidelines for outdoor developed areas for public comment. And even though it says outdoor developed areas, these guidelines also apply to trails, trailheads, as well as picnic areas and camping areas. When the guidelines become final, which is expected to happen maybe later this year, and I should note the guidelines have been in development for about 10 years, they will only apply to federal land. At some point in the future, the Access Board does plan to develop similar guidelines for non-federal entities, but until that occurs, there are no federal accessibility standards that apply to Cosca trails and open space. So even though no federal standards do apply to Cosca trails, Cosca staff is committed to enhancing accessibility. We plan to do this by implementing several widely accepted practices for improving accessibility, including removing barriers to trail entry by those, especially by those using personal mobility devices, by providing objective trail condition information to allow trail users to make informed decisions about which trails they would like to try, and by seeking input from interested community members. And finally, as you heard earlier, we are committed to constructing the new planned trail in Hill Canyon as part of the Conejo Canyons Management Plan to be accessible to users of personal mobility devices. I'm going to go into detail on each of these projects that I just mentioned. In 2009, the Rangers installed an accessible trail entry structure in Wildwood Park in order, as a pilot project, to test its design, and I have a photo of that structure on the next slide. We are pleased with the pilot project so far, and the Rangers have committed to installing 5 additional accessible trail entry structures at some of the most popular trailheads in the open space this fiscal year. That would include the Lang Ranch areas and Los Robles Trail, certain entrances to the Los Robles Trail. And if this expanded test of the accessible entry structures is successful, and by that the primary test will be whether access by motorcycles and other off-road vehicles increases once we install those devices, and you'll see when I show the photo on the next page why we have some concerns about that. But if the test is successful, we will continue placing these accessible structures throughout our trail system. This is the photo of the trail entry structure that was installed in Wildwood Park. As you can see, it narrows at the top, which is intended to block the motorcycle handlebars and off-road vehicle handlebars while allowing access by people in a wheelchair, people pushing strollers, or any other number of devices that they may be using. Generally, these type of trail entry structures, which are fairly widely used in the Bay Area, for example, in California, are installed in parallel with a step-over device so that horses can gain access to the trails. And this is a photo from the Bay Area showing that. The structure on the left of the photo is a step-over. We have a different, we use a different form of step-over, but this is probably the system that we would use of the 2 entry structures in parallel in the open space. In Wildwood, they're not in parallel because we have another entrance just a few hundred feet away that is accessible to equestrians. In addition, staff, with assistance from volunteers, is going to begin the implementation of the Universal Trail Assessment process, also known as UTAP. The UTAP process collects and provides information on trail characteristics such as grade, width, cross slope, surface type, and trail length. We will be holding a UTAP trail leader training in November in concert with a trail construction training class. And once we have collected the UTAP information, we will post it at the trailheads and on our website so that it will be accessible to the public. This slide shows the typical collection method for the UTAP information. Is usually groups of at least 2, but up to 5 people. The trail is measured with a level, you can see in the photo, with a measuring tape to measure the width, and the woman in the background has a clinometer to measure the slope. And on a clipboard, the team members also note the trail surface type, and they use a roller wheel to measure the trail length. Recently, a procedure called HETAP has been developed, which is High Efficiency Trail Assessment Program, which essentially automates the process so that one person can do this. This photo here shows the setup. It's a modified jogging stroller with a ruggedized laptop on the top, and on the bottom there's a box that has a GPS and gyroscopes, and the software has been improved so it really automates the function. You actually have to go pretty slow. It's only 1 mile per hour that you average, but it's still much faster than the 5-person team manual entry on a clipboard and then going back to the office to enter it on your computer. So this, it is pretty expensive for us, but it's something that we would like to purchase if we're able. It certainly would speed up the process of collecting this information system-wide. This photo shows what the typical UTAP information sign at a trailhead would look like. This is just an example. May be difficult to see, but it has it shows what type of uses are allowed on the trail. It shows the name of the length of the trail, the typical trail grade, the maximum trail grade, the typical cross slope and maximum cross slope, etc. And finally, staff will be forming the accessibility working group. This group will be composed of staff and interested community members, and will meet quarterly or as otherwise needed. Any proposals for accessibility improvements that are proposed by the working group will be reviewed by Cosca before implementation or before approval by the Cosca board. And the goal of the accessibility working group would be to solicit input and feedback from actual trail users, preferably disabled trail users, in getting feedback in, given our limited budget and limited staff capabilities, what are the things that we can do that will have the most impact or that are the most desired by the community, and really get the public input on what we can do to improve accessibility. Well, that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Ford. Are there questions of Ms. Ford? Mr. Langton, you had another comment?
Thank you. Excuse me. Again, as you know, I'm with the Caneo Open Space Trails Advisory Committee, which was just referenced in terms of review to this process once it goes forward. I really just want to reiterate that any plans regarding UTAP will be reviewed by COSDAC, because this could be quite an expensive process. I don't have any problem personally or as the representative of COSDAC with this process, but if you start considering our trail system and 140 miles plus of trails it being considered for the possibility of this kind of accessibility, it's quite extensive, and I would just be concerned and a little bit apprehensive to start committing to this kind of a process when there is this much expense involved. So again, I'm not in any way saying that I am not in favor of this process, but I think that we have to look at the overall cost associated with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Langton. Mr. Gibson?
Yeah. I would share a similar sentiment. I'll be the first to say, because I have issues with walking and things like that, but I would not want to see us employ a program that we're trying to make every inch of every 140 miles totally accessible. I think there needs to be reasonableness and prudence. I mean, the issues such as the entries and things like that are important. I have problems walking over some of that stuff now. Fortunately, I'm not to the point yet where I need any sort of accessible device full time. But by the same token, I have to understand my personal limitations, and I don't think it's prudent or reasonable for us to have to, backfit every trail we have just so I can theoretically have access. Enjoyment needs to be part of the personal responsibility aspect as well. I would also, while it's nice to have the fancy widgets and toys, again, these, the ability to do this program without incurring substantial costs, and what we would do with a piece of equipment like that after we got done, I don't know. I mean, I guess we can give it to code compliance and they can check sidewalks or something. But from that standpoint, I would really look to utilize the COSTAC group and any additional volunteers we have to look at this and approach it, again, being prudent and reasonable.
Mr. Jacobson?
I think one of the concerns was really touched on by Director Gibson, and that is budgetarily, what kind of an impact will we have? Would this be overkill in attempting to itemize and document very precisely information which would be of minimal use to a majority of the community? I was wondering if there is any mechanism by which GPI or satellite type information could be used over a longer stretch of a trail to identify the average slope or average difficulty in transiting a trail or a group of trails. I really feel that it's somewhat overkill at this time because I haven't seen a demonstrated need. It looks nice, but I think we would need to look at alternatives that would be more economically feasible. Secondly, that maybe the information distributed either in documentation or on the web or in COSTAC and Cosca publications use a very general classification on its trails as to difficulty, limited maybe to A, B, or C, or 1, 2, or 3, or categories that are very limited in the scope of commitment that would otherwise have to be made by and paid for by Cosca. I really do have a concern on continuing to the degree that was identified in your presentation.
We do have one more speaker, but Ms. Ford, did you have any more clarification?
I do have a few clarifications to provide context, perhaps. As I mentioned, the federal outdoor accessibility guidelines have been proposed and are likely to be in place soon. And similar guidelines won't be in place for other non-federal agencies for a while. However, we can infer that when those guidelines do come online for us, they will probably be similar to those that will be in place for the federal agencies. And those guidelines, as they, the final draft guidelines, do require and will require for federal agencies at every trailhead that trail signs shall include the following information: the length of the trail, the surface type, the typical and minimum tread width, the typical and maximum slope, and typical and maximum cross slope. So while it may be possible that those can be determined through remote sensing methods using Google Maps or other means, there is a certain amount of this information in order to provide averages and minimum and maximums. We will need to gather this type of information for most of the length of the trails. And doing the UTAP process, collecting this information with volunteers will have little to no cost. The equipment is the primary cost, most of which we do have already in-house. We are going to need several sets of measuring tapes, several sets of levels, et cetera, but we already do have several that we own, and the cost of purchasing that additional equipment is minimal. The cost for the high-efficiency standalone unit is approximately $10,000. That includes the cart, the ruggedized laptop, and the information collecting device. So we could do that, or again, we can do it for essentially no cost with the volunteers, and just know that it will be a longer process.
Okay. Mr. Greenway?
Thank you. Everything I've heard here sounds very appropriate as far as a way to approach it. Money is always going to be a factor, and also the input from the board. I imagine this is going to be a board-initiated effort through staff. 3 years ago, 3 of us got together and had the benefit of being informal and trying to get something rolling, which we were making progress, and then there are reassignments. And also whether I guess things that need to be determined, of course, are budget restrictions. How to use, or how are you going to process all of this UTAP data? Once it's collected, it has to be coordinated, made into a database, distributed. How do you distribute it? If you're going to get really fancy, you could have it available to your phone so that while you're on the trail you could check it out. There may be side benefits, just as in the curb cuts, where people use them for all types of things. These accessibility and information could be quite beneficial to the general public, as well as someone who might use it to make a decision as to whether they would get on that particular trail. So I would think that the board should consider whether they would develop the higher level guidelines, restrictions, whatever you wish to call them, which I think that's what I'm hearing from Board Member Gibson and others. This is something that is your function and something that this working group would need, in my opinion. Since Mark Town and Lauren Pluth and myself were on this informal group, we were aware of a lot of these things, and gathering information is certainly one thing, and I think our approach is going to be to just we picked out 4 trails with Mark's help to say, okay, we'll try these and then go from experience on what happens there. Now that it's becomes formalized, I believe the board has a function, and hopefully also as trail users are out there, is Cosca held harmless from any accidents, injuries caused by someone's inappropriate use of information? How could you ever determine that? I would hope so. That's the way it is in the national park system. I believe if you go on the trail, you're taking full responsibility for what happens to you. So if the board has any questions, I'll be glad to answer it. Otherwise, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greenway. Appreciate your comments. This is a status report. We're not taking any action today. But Mr. Jacobson, did you have another comment?
Only to say that if we're undertaking any part of the program that was described by staff, I think we should have it presented to the board to take a sample of typically what might provide us information as to the costs and the correct approach that we should adopt, should we be required to, or we decide to undertake this procedure for all of the trails. I think we should have a selection and a very limited program, and I would look for staff to come to us with something that would meet that requirement of sampling and determining how realistic some of the information is that had been provided to us in your verbal presentation.
And we'll note that the idea of forming a working group is an informal working group is a very good idea, because in that way maybe you all can then identify, well, let's look at this particular spot without trying to trying to blanket everything. I think we do have to take baby steps here, and we have the luxury of not having the federal guidelines adopted and applying to us at this point in time. So, but let's try and kind of get ahead of the curve, but take it in increments and see, build on some successes. See, like you said, the simple measures of some trails, trying out the new pass-throughs instead of the step-overs, and then getting feedback from the rangers and the users. I mean, is it working? Is it being used? Are we having issues with off-road vehicles still getting through, and then come back and try and adapt it again? So I'm actually very pleased with this approach. Ms. Ford.
Yeah, I did just have a couple more clarifications that I wanted to make. Even the federal guidelines and generally what's currently accepted practice is that accessibility improvements need only to be made when new trails are constructed or existing trails are significantly reconstructed, which does not include normal annual maintenance. And so that certainly would be something, that's the scope that we're considering as well, is for new trails. And this is in terms of additional improvements. And then however, the step-overs, replacing the step-overs, it's extremely inexpensive. It's all done in-house by the ranger staff. It's a little bit of wood and some bolts. So we do not feel that those are a significant expense, but we'd be happy to bring back more detail on these proposals to the board at a future meeting.
Very good. Thank you very much. We are on to board member comments. We've already gotten the good news about your 50th wedding anniversary. Director Jacobson, I think that's fantastic. Do you have any comments?
The only comment I was going to make is my wife and I have been happily married for 7 years. We've been married for 50, but only for 7.
That was the first 700.
Relative to board member comments, could we anticipate that sometime in the future we'll have a statusing of the encroachment problems that have been experienced to date and the status of those, some of which are major, and the resolution thereof?
Yes, we can provide that.
Okay. Any other comments? Hearing none, we are adjourned until September 8th in this room. Thank you very much, staff and public.
have a treat for you today. We're here at the NASA Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex
with Louis Berrios and what appears to be an actual mission control center, but it's not. It's a restoration.
What we have here is a recreation with a lot of authenticity from the original Mission Control Center facility on Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. This particular Mission Control Center, the consoles and all of the hardware and strip printers, the tracking map that we see behind us, were all relocated from that facility and brought together here. We've done a very good job of creating as much of an authentic recreation as we can with the finishes, the flooring, the architectural elements, but the real heart and soul and the essence of the room are these consoles.
This control center was actually used during the Mercury program.
It was. It was used for 6 flights during the Mercury program and 1 flight, the first flight, Gemini 3, that sent 2 astronauts into space. That flight was piloted by John Young and Gus Grissom. This was state-of-the-art back in 1961. This was the cutting edge of technology.
Cutting edge, that's important.
That's right. We like it. Yeah.
You say it's authentic because, I mean, you can't, if you're putting together an exhibit like this, you can't go buy stuff like this. It actually existed specifically for the purposes of...
That's really important because part of the storytelling, our commitment to creating emotional connections about NASA's work and celebrating the human accomplishments comes from integrating authentic spaceflight hardware, consoles, spacecraft, tools, astronaut suits. When we can carefully choreograph their presentation into our storytelling, we create home runs.
This is really cool because the public actually gets a chance to see what it looked like back during the
And it's neat because our guests are made up of, family experience, so it's kind of neat to see the reactions when a grandparent comes in with their grandchild and says, I remember seeing those on my black and white TV set back when you weren't even around.
Well, speaking of that, you were talking about authenticity. If you bring in some former folks that actually worked in mission control, I mean, did it pass the authenticity test?
Very much so. Absolutely. It really opens up a memory for them, and in some cases gives back the goosebumps that they felt when they were right here at the moment. They were a big part of what's going on with our space exploration program.
Well, what's really cool is that that grandfather who brings in their grandchild and sees one of the original consoles, and then what's it going to be like, let's say, 20 years down the road in terms of what mission
That's the beauty of that, is that look how far we've come, and yet look how far we'll go. We don't even know. We're just scratching the surface of the accomplishments and achievements that NASA is going to honor and celebrate in the years to come. And the fact that this Mission Control Center is here since 1998, we've been able to share it with over 10 million people.
Wow.
That's something we couldn't do very easily in its original location.
That's right.
Roger, loud and clear. Roger, coming in to thank you a little bit. That little contrail went by the window or something there. We're smoothing out some now, getting out of the vibration area. Roger, you feel max Q, flight path is. Roger, feels good through max Q and it's smoothing out real fine. Cabin pressure coming down by 7. Okay, flight very smooth now. Sky looking very dark outside.
Unbelievable room.
Oh, wow.
Don't you kind of hear voices?
Yeah, it's almost as if you can hear, history.
Yeah, it's like...
Look at this.
Indicating 16. Bingo. Lots of grades fired. Okay. Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous. And I can see the booster doing turnaround just a couple of 100 yards behind me. It was beautiful. Roger. Roger. Understand go for at least 7 orbits. This is Friendship 7. Can see clear back of big cloud pattern way back across toward the Cape. Beautiful sight.
There are there's a tremendous amount of responsibilities that each of the gentlemen that manned the consoles in this room and the Consequent had a role, a very specific role. Their job was to manage the content, to track the data that was coming in for the spacecraft or the astronauts' biorhythms, you know, their pulse, their heart rate, their blood pressure, and that would help them make decisions.
Breaking off all the way through. Roger, altimeter off the peg indicating 80,000. Roger, radio loud and clear. Roger.
And along the map, what you have are these circles that follow the tracking stations along the orbital path.
Gotcha.
The red ones represent a circle where there may be a problem at that particular tracking station that they're working. Yellow ones mean that they're okay but have a couple of small things, and the green ones means they're go, so they can keep constant traction of how that spacecraft is making its path along the orbital.
I'm getting all kinds of contrails and stuff outside out here. Ship 7 going to drogue early. It's a drogue came out. Drogue is out. Roger, drogue came out at 30,000 and about a 90-degree yaw. Chute is on green. Chute is out in reach condition at 10,800 feet and beautiful chute. Chute looks good. Rate of descent has gone to about 42 feet per second. The chute looks very good. Ship 7 standing by for impact. Ship 7 getting close, standing by. There we go. And Ship 7 impact. Rescue agents manual.
Earlier, I was walking around, I flipped about every switch imaginable in here. It's not wired to anything, right?
No,
there's no jeopardy there, right?
No, what we've tried to do is create some of the animations and show that these buttons are, in fact, that they have lights behind them, but they're not right now wired or networked into anything that will cause a catastrophic event.
So what you're saying is, well, I just want to clarify. Yeah. It's safe to say that if Blair doesn't touch any of these buttons, those rockets in the rocket garden aren't just taking off.
Unfortunately, no. We're not able to do any live demonstrations in that regard, but we are able to share that there's a lot of hardware in here, a lot of buttons to push, a lot of knobs and gauges to keep track of. So it's very serious work.
Well, Willie, I want to thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to show this old Mission Control Center, and it's a beautifully restored Mission Control Center.
And maybe one day you can wire this up for me to launch my own lunar missions if possible.
You know what? When you're ready, you let me know, and we'll see what we can do.
So you might lose on the authenticity at that point.
But it will be relevant.
Hey, you're watching NASA Edge.
An inside and outside look at all things NASA.
Hi, I'm Mark Watkins, Public Works Director for the City of Thousand Oaks. Once again, I'm taking this opportunity to remind you to save water. As Southern Californians, we must remember that we live in an arid region and rely on imported water to meet our needs. As responsible residents and business owners, we need to abide by common sense measures for water conservation. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, the water supplier for 19 million Southern Californians, including the City of Thousand Oaks, has established a water supply allocation which requires us to reduce our water use by 15%, or we could face penalties of up to $4 million. These penalties, of course, would require an increase in water rates. Yes, it rained earlier this year, and for this we are extremely grateful. However, this year's rainfall in no way makes up for the past 5 dry years, nor can it account for the strict environmental controls in place restricting the conveyance of water throughout the state. The bottom line is that it's imperative that we reduce our water usage. That's why permanent and mandatory conservation measures were implemented last year and remain in effect today. Some of the simple and effective measures now in effect are irrigating your yard only after 5 p.m. in the evening or before 9 a.m. in the morning, with early morning watering being the most effective. All plumbing or irrigation leaks must be fixed as soon as they are discovered. Even something as simple as a running toilet can waste as much as 7,000 gallons per month. Use a hose with an automatic shut-off nozzle when washing your car. Sweep your driveway or sidewalk rather than using a hose. Restaurants serve water only upon request by the customer. And most importantly, irrigate a maximum of 3 days per week. Over the past year, we have talked with many residents and businesses throughout the city and have many success stories from happy citizens that are saving water and money. With water being synonymous with life, we simply must use it wisely. Together, we can use water wisely and still have a beautiful Thousand Oaks. Thanks for your help in meeting our water conservation goals.
On the timeline for July 14th. On this day in 1882, sailors and Marines from 4 U.S. ships landed at Alexandria, Egypt, to help restore order in that city during a time of unrest. On July 14, 1918, Army Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt was killed in aerial combat over France. The youngest son of former President Theodore Roosevelt was shot down near Chateau Thierry. The Air Force Logistics Command traces its roots to July 14, 1921, when the Army Air Service created the Property Maintenance Cost Compilation Section to manage its supply and maintenance depots. On this day in 1945, Navy ships and aircraft bombed Japanese merchant vessels, rail facilities, and ground installations in the northern Honshu and Hokkaido Islands. This was the first naval gunfire directed against Japan's home islands during World War II. For July 14th, that's the timeline.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPD to advance excellent teaching.
After the Civil War, new voices rang out from the pages of books. Voices that sounded unfamiliar but real.
We said there warn't no home like a raft after all. Other places do seem so cramped up and smothery, but a raft don't. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft.
Writers emerged to demand representation in the popular imagination for their part of America. Their words reflected a new realism, and they would change American literature forever.
You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. That book was made by a Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth, mainly.
No one did more to transform the novel in America than Mark Twain, and he just opened things up for every novelist, every fiction writer who came along after him.
Novelist Ernest Hemingway said, "All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn." Like other realists of his time, Twain favored the real over the romantic, and his work opened up new regions and new voices.
What begins to happen in the process of democratization of America after the Civil War is that suddenly our writers are coming from the wrong side of the tracks. They're coming from the wrong part of the country. They're not coming from New England, coming from the Midwest, from the South. They're outsiders to the literary establishment.
After the Civil War, Americans came to the realization that their nation spanned a continent. Writers broke with Romanticism to write about life as it was, and in the process, satirized and criticized American society. It's a genre many critics call regional realism. Whether in the gold mining camps in California or Indian reservations on the Great Plains, exposing regional life was the writer's aim, and the southern states produced some of the best of this work. Writing between 1865 and 1910, 3 writers, Mark Twain, Charles Chesnutt, and Kate Chopin, explored divisive national issues through characters who spoke in the dialect of their region, the American South. There was Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, Twain's poor boys from Missouri.
Aunt Polly's awful particular about this fence. It's got to be done very careful. I reckon there ain't one boy in 1,000, maybe 2,000, that can do it the way it's got to be done.
Charles Chesnutt wrote in the voices of the Deep South.
Oh, my Dougal McAdoo, what displeased long many years before the war. And I remember well when it shot out all this here pipe plantation in this coupon on. Them vines grow mustard fast.
Kate Chopin used the exotic dialect of Cajun Louisiana.
Hey, Papa, no, what's the matter? Why you standing platter like old Mom Tina's cow in the bog, yo?
These 3 writers created complex characters who spoke regional dialects and often confronted difficult situations. For the first time, readers experienced the rhythms, culture, and contradictions of the South.
All 3 of these writers really complicated and enriched the idea of what an American is. After the Civil War, a whole new area of the country is connected to the East by rail and telegraph. These regions are insisting on being heard from.
So what regionalism literature does is to help us identify with people that we might not normally meet on a day-to-day basis in places that we may never go. But as Americans, we have a vested interest in knowing.
The Civil War had sobered the American public more than any event to that moment. Matthew Brady's battlefield photographs brought home the horrors of war. If Mr. Brady has not brought bodies and laid them on our dooryard and along the streets, wrote the New York Times, he has done something very like it. Suddenly, the heroic idealism of romantic literature rang false. Mark Twain sharply defined this break from romanticism in his later essay entitled Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses.
Mark Twain's sketch, Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, is extremely funny, and it's wonderfully unfair to Cooper. It's unfair because Cooper finally is writing romantic fiction, which plays by different rules than Twain wants to play by. This is a case of an American realist taking on an American romantic.
The conversations in the Cooper books have a curious sound in our modern ears. To believe that such talk really ever came out of people's mouths would be to believe that there was a time when time was of no value to a person who thought he had something to say.
One of the ulterior motives in Twain's attack on Cooper is to take a shot at the whole genteel literary culture of the East, which is upholding a kind of fiction and a kind of so-called serious literature. And so one of the things Twain is trying to do is write a kind of literary declaration of independence when he goes after Cooper.
Why do place and dialect become so central to American national identity? What is the America these writers see around them? For Southerners, like Twain, Reconstruction brought the prospect of real change.
The
The meaning of Reconstruction varies with who's asking the question and who's answering the question. For white Republicans in Washington, D.C., Reconstruction meant solidifying the gains of the Civil War. For black Republicans in the South, it meant a chance for them to take part in the small d democratic process. For the people who had been in power in the South, it was a disaster. It was Negro rule, it was carpetbaggers and scalawags, and the worst thing that could possibly happen. Historians today, I think, generally would agree that it was a lost chance to democratize the South.
Life after the Civil War is fluid. It's changing rapidly, socially, technologically, in every other way. The ethnic face of America is undergoing rapid kinds of change. People really don't know where we're headed. And so a lot of the fiction, I think, a lot of the best fiction, leaves us up in the air to contemplate those kinds of dilemmas together.
After the war, Mark Twain took up the challenge of race relations and used realism to confront Americans with the issue.
It distressed Twain that Reconstruction was not as successful as Lincoln had envisioned it, as African Americans had desired it to be, and as abolitionists had dreamt that it would be. By the time he started writing Huck Finn, he had sort of a transformation himself with his relationship with African Americans and slavery, with how he had grown up within the shadow of slavery.
Mark Twain has remained an enduring American icon. Born Samuel Clemens in 1835, Twain picked up his pen name working on a Mississippi riverboat. Mark Twain was the cry which signified 2 fathoms deep, marking the edge of dangerous waters. Twain's childhood in Hannibal, Missouri was the source of endless material, inspiration for all too human characters.
What makes an author, I think, a great author, is that he or she can compel the audience to enter into an agreement that we are going to explore the nature of this character or characters and their setting. But even after having closed the book, closed the cover, we will be forever transformed by that experience. And that's what Twain does. He literally grabs you by the scruff of the neck and just doesn't let go. And he makes it an uncomfortable ride.
The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is considered Twain's masterpiece. Though written after Reconstruction, the story takes place before the Civil War. A young man and a runaway slave face the unknown on a raft drifting down the Mississippi River. The shore and its towns represent danger, the river, solace and refuge. The river also carries them further south and further into the world of slavery.
One of the things that's great about Huckleberry Finn is that Twain creates a voice that we haven't heard before, and he keeps faith with it. He sees the world courageously and persistently from the point of view of an uneducated 14-year-old boy in the late 1840s.
When I woke up, I didn't know where I was for a minute. I sat up and looked around, a little scared. Then I remembered the river looked miles and miles across.
It's in some ways a celebration of a kind of spirit which Twain thinks can emerge raw from the American heartland.
Though we think of Huckleberry Finn as comic, Mark Twain's novel is a story of murder, death, and above all, slavery.
He's the one who dares rip off the scab and really look at the wound and, sort of says, we're not going to put a Band-Aid on this anymore. It needs to be opened up to heal.
Huckleberry Finn still inspires controversy. When it was first published, it was banned and condemned as vulgar. In modern times, Twain's depiction of African Americans, and especially his use of the term nigger, have become emotional flashpoints.
I worry when I hear some people say, well, you know, Huck Finn is just so wonderful, and don't worry, don't get upset about the novel because it's satire. There's humor there. And I'm thinking, no, don't do that. Yes, there is satire there, but it's an uncomfortable novel. It's a rough novel. It's a tragic novel. And Twain meant for all of that to happen. So, you know, I think he is important for that reason. He gives this whole idea of local color some reality.
It was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a nigger. But I done it, and I wasn't ever sorry for it afterwards neither.
I'm not sure at the end of Huckleberry Finn that Huck has come to any breakthrough with regard to African Americans. I think he's come to a big breakthrough with regard to Jim. He's encountered one person in a sustained way, and he has realized that this person is a complete and dignified human being.
Twain was writing against powerful Southern tradition. One of the most enduring Southern myths was that of the plantation.
The plantation myth, or Moonlighted Magnolias, if you wish, goes like this. Here we have this lovely, beautiful place in, say, South Carolina or Virginia, in which everything is beautiful and everything is well kept. Presiding over this lovely place are an educated, kind couple with lovely children. And around them are devoted servants, not slaves, servants, who love working for them. That's the myth.
Many white writers perpetuated the sentimental plantation myth by popularizing African folk tales. They told stories with black characters who spoke in a heavy dialect of the Deep South. As an African American and a Southerner, writer Charles Chestnut also grappled with the depiction of Southern blacks, like his character Uncle Julius in the short story, The Gooford Grapevine.
When the season is nigh, about over, and the grapes begin to swivel up, there's a little with the wrinkles or old age. When the skin gets soft and brown, then the scuppernong make you smack your lip and roll your eye and whoosh for mo. Wonderful. You know, I mean, it's just fantastic. Because, again, unlike Jim, who's from Missouri, Chestnut is writing about the Deep South. And Deep South slaves who stayed on the plantations. And this is the way one would sound.
While some white writers' use of dialect reinforced negative stereotypes about Southern blacks, Chestnut's Uncle Julius survives on his wits, a character who is craftily subversive and wise.
And so it shows that we have a very calculated, intelligent, clever man who's using race to his advantage, using the fact that they think he isn't so smart as a way of outsmarting them.
Charles Chestnut was born in 1858 in Cleveland, Ohio, the son of free blacks from North Carolina. His parents returned to North Carolina when Charles was 8 years old. Later in life, he became a school principal, a stenographer, and eventually a lawyer. The expansion of the magazine industry gave Chestnut his first opportunity to publish. His works depicted both average Southern blacks and those of mixed blood who lived on the color line.
Chestnut puts us right back on the plantation after Reconstruction, which takes it one step further than Twain does, and shows us a resilient individual. You know, I may not be, quote, working class. I may not be that porter in the North, or I may not be the scholar that W.B. Boyce is, but I'm a survivor. And this is how I make meaning and survive in the South with power structure.
Chestnut's African Americans are finally psychologically more complex, more enigmatic, and more compelling than Mark Twain's African Americans.
In Chestnut's short story, The Wife of His Youth, a light-skinned former slave has moved north and become successful. One day, an uneducated dark-skinned woman appears at his front door claiming to be his wife. In this confrontation, Chestnut heightens the couple's differences using language and dialect.
But when Sam come back, he didn't find me, so I wasn't there. Old Moss had heard that I warned Sam, so he had me whooped and sold down the river.
He may have married another woman. Your slave marriage would not have prevented him, for you never lived with him after the war, and without that, your marriage doesn't count.
Wouldn't make no difference with Sam. He wouldn't marry no other woman till he found out about me. I knows it. Something's been telling me all these years I was gonna find Sam before I die.
What this touches on is a phenomenon very little commented upon in American history, and that is the tremendous groping after the Civil War of all these black people whose families had been severed by the slave trade. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people.
The interesting thing about Chestnut is he's half white, half African American, and at various times in his life he seems to be on one side of that divide and sometimes on the other. His fiction seems to evolve gradually into a more direct engagement of an affirmation of his African American identity.
As a person of mixed race, Chestnut felt removed from both white and black society. From this distance, Chestnut explored issues of race within the black community.
There are moments in Chestnut's stories where he seems not to know which side of a divide he should be on, and whether or not he and his people and their body of cultural experience can ever be embraced and accepted into a larger culture.
Setting her stories in Cajun, Louisiana, another Southern writer, Kate Chopin, also raised the issue of race. In her short story, Desiree's Baby, a couple who assumes they are white produces a baby with black features. In this passage, the mother slowly realizes the truth.
One of LeBlanche's little quadroon boys stood fanning the child slowly with a fan of peacock feathers. She looked from her child to the boy, who stood beside him and back again, over and over. It was a cry that she could not help, which when she was not conscious of having uttered.
In the case of Desiree's Baby, what Chopin does in that story is she shows the reader, first of all, that race is so powerful that it can destroy people's lives.
Born in St. Louis in 1850, Kate Chopin was raised in a highly literate Roman Catholic family of Irish and French heritage. At the age of 19, she married Oscar Chopin, a cotton tycoon. She was taken to Louisiana, where she became immersed in the French Cajun culture.
After a number of years down there, her husband dies. Kate moves back to St. Louis. She begins to write stories about the world that she experienced in the South and the predicament of women now.
In her novel, The Awakening, Chopin tells the bittersweet story of Edna Pontellier, a woman who escapes the confines of Southern society by committing suicide in the ocean after an adulterous affair. As she sheds her clothes, she casts off the constraints of society.
Edna cast the unpleasant, prickling garments from her, and for the first time in her life, she stood naked in the open air, at the mercy of the sun, the breeze that beat upon her, and the waves that invited her.
She kept testing the waters in America with challenges, and eventually she went too far as society was concerned. When she published her great novel, The Awakening, in 1899, it was banned in St. Louis.
Kate Chopin is the feminist. I love Kate Chopin. I think she's so cool. She writes about all the things that women think about but would never talk about. And she puts it on paper so that we can sort of quietly cheer and say, yeah, I've been feeling that way.
It had been very, very dangerous to talk about discontent deep discontent in domestic relationships, in marriages, in what passed for love. And it was doubly scary to write about sexuality as having something to do with that discontent.
Her deft depiction of settings and development of characters is evident in her short story, At the Cadian Ball.
The big, low-ceiled room, they called it a hall, was packed with men and women dancing to the music of 3 fiddles. Anyone who's white may go to a Cadian ball, but he must pay for his lemonade, his coffee, and chicken gumbo. And he must behave himself like a Cadian.
What did Kate Chopin do for women's literature? She opened up a whole new territory for women writers to explore, a territory which had really been closed by decorum and social mores up until that point.
Chopin wrote against the romantic notion of women as pure and morally uplifting. Her sequel to At the Cadian Ball, a steamy story called The Storm, was too controversial to be published in her lifetime. Chopin's married female protagonist has a passionate one-night stand, but then happily returns to her husband with no negative consequences.
He pushed her hair back from her face that was warm and steaming. Her lips were as red and moist as pomegranate seed. Her white neck and a glimpse of her full, firm bosom disturbed him powerfully. He looked down into her eyes, and there was nothing for him to do but to gather her lips in a kiss. It just doesn't get any more passionate, does it? You know, again, wonderful Chopin. Not before Chopin in American fiction do we have a voice for American women.
On the surface, it just seems to be a kind of bold challenge to the notion that if you sin, if you have sex with someone who isn't your husband or wife, commit adultery, that you should be sad and punished and tormented with guilt. And the way that story ends suggests that's not the case, that she can have this wonderful experience of being reconnected with a former lover and not pay a price for that at all.
Writers of regional realism rejected idealistic romanticism to bear witness to the life they saw around them.
In each instance, we've learned a little bit more about a particular place in America. We've heard the voice of someone we would not ordinarily meet in his and her own language. We have experienced their passions.
Regional realists created interesting characters faced with moral dilemmas and no easy answers. Chopin's women became interesting, empowered characters. Chestnut's people of color struggled with issues of identity. And Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn was ready to quit civilization and light out for the territories.
In all of these authors, in Twain, Chestnut, and Chopin, what we find is that these characters make choices. They exert freedom of choice. It may not be what I would have chosen, but I'm not those people. I'm not in their situation. They're allowing me to peek in. So they choose. They make the decision.
If you're looking around for what it is that you want to define as American, it's this ongoing, unsettled questioning about what it is that makes us what we are. And Chopin and Twain and Chestnut open that question, and they don't glibly answer it. They complicate it, they enrich it, they give us characters and situations where a society, a community, and an individual self are in motion, are going someplace, even if we don't see them actually get there.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPD to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPD programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org. To learn more about the Annenberg CPB Channel series and workshops for teachers, how to take them for credit, how to buy them on video cassette, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org/channel. The Annenberg CPB Channel.
Los Robles Greens in beautiful Thousand Oaks. Treat yourself to endless beauty in a truly challenging round of golf. A true golfer's destination. Los Robles Greens continues to be a public course in a private course setting. With its giant oak tree-lined fairways that guard many of its stunning greens, to its breathtaking approaches, Los Robles Greens continues to deliver the difference. For convenient tee times, visit us online at losroblesgreens.com. Los Robles Greens, delivering the difference.
No car? Thousand Oaks Transit can help you get to work, school, or just around town. Next time you need a ride, let TOT do the driving. Thousand Oaks Transit. We're going places.
Annenberg Media.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume
the war for independence had been fought and won. But as leaders built a new nation, they faced many questions.
How do you reintegrate loyalists who have remained in the country? What do you do about women? What do you do about Native Americans? What do you do about African Americans? 5,000 of whom had served in Patriot forces.
With so many questions unanswered, this new nation faced an uncertain future.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence promised equality. But by the end of the Revolution, some leaders regretted those words. Many people were asking why they didn't have the same rights guaranteed to white men. But within the government, debates focused on the division of federal and state powers. The nation had been created, but battles still went on about how it would function and who would have a voice.
One of the main problems, political problems, facing revolutionary leadership in the post-revolutionary period was what is the relationship, how will we redefine the relationship of people to the state?
The new nation's leaders fought bitterly over which rights would remain with the states and which would be given to the federal government. After many rounds of negotiations, compromises, and uncertainties, the Federalists finally pushed the Constitution through ratification by the states. But in exchange for the sweeping rights granted to the central government, Federalists compromised, ceding to the states the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights included the freedoms of religion and due process, as well as freedom of speech and of the press. These rights officially sanctioned public dissension against the government.
The idea that you could be in opposition to government and still be loyal escalated during the Washington and Adams administration with, for example, the proliferation of democratic-republican societies, which are popular societies populated primarily by artisans and mechanics, ordinary people who had not participated in the political process before, but now claim to be the voice of the people.
Laborers and craftsmen had claimed a role in the political process, but wealthy landowners leading the Federalist Party maintained control of the presidency. But it was an ever-narrowing margin. When John Adams lost the presidential election to Thomas Jefferson in 1800, America saw its first major shift in political leadership and witnessed a groundbreaking peaceful transference of power between parties. Washington resident Mrs. Margaret Bayard Smith marveled at the inauguration.
I have this morning witnessed one of the most interesting scenes a free people can ever witness. The change of an administration, which in every age have most generally been epochs of confusion, villainy, and bloodshed. In this, our happy country, take place without any species of distraction or disorder.
Although the new republic peacefully conducted its first transfer of political power, shifts in economic and social power caused turmoil. After ratification of the Constitution in 1788, many citizens who had actively supported the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality now agitated for their own place in the new nation. Most Americans still lived in rural areas, but a growing number began migrating to towns and cities to find wage-paying jobs at mills and iron forges. Thus, in cities like Charleston in New York, economic gaps widened between prosperous merchants, middle-class artisans, and an underclass of common laborers and slaves.
Philadelphia, just about the largest city in the New World in the 1790s into 1800. Also, it was a place where people of many nationalities, ethnic groups were gathering.
Unlike most rural settlements, city populations included multiple ethnicities. Significant numbers of Irish, German, British, and African Americans were living side by side, often for the first time.
A place like Philadelphia, there were people who lived in the same block. Notables like Betsy Ross lived with a person who was a former slave a few doors down. So the neighborhoods were both racially and economically diverse.
But revolutionary events outside the states were feeding interracial tensions. In the Caribbean, growing unrest against French colonial rule had exploded into the largest and most successful slave rebellion in North American history, the Haitian Revolution. American slave owners dreaded the potential reverberations.
Because there was so much fear of what they call the contagion of revolution, the fear that this is going to spread and you'll have a massive slave uprising that simply can't be contained.
Such fears were not unfounded. In the summer of 1800, a slave in Richmond, Virginia, planned a rebellion. His name was Gabriel. Torrential rainstorms foiled Gabriel's plan to arm 1,000 slaves in the Richmond uprising. He and 25 co-conspirators were captured and hanged. However, Gabriel's rebellion was not an isolated incident. Numerous violent acts, planned and spontaneous, erupted across the land, reflecting the deep resentment within the enslaved and free black communities. At the same time, the new nation was also defining itself politically in relation to its expanding borders. Immediately following the Revolution, the U.S. Congress attempted to treat Native Americans as conquered peoples. However, by 1789, the policy had become so unsuccessful, the government officially acknowledged Native American rights to the lands they inhabited. Recognizing the sovereignty of tribal nations, the federal government now claimed the exclusive right to negotiate land treaties, just as they did with international powers. Relations between the government and Native Americans were further complicated by the continued presence of European powers within the North American backcountry. Sharing a desire to keep settlers from expanding into the continent's interior, foreign countries shrewdly cultivated relationships with the Native Americans.
New American government in the 1780s and early 90s was so weak it could not force the British out of Detroit. And so the British continually told the Native American people who lived in Ohio and Michigan, you do not have to acquiesce to American demands because this new American government probably won't last.
But as more Americans wanted to move west, the conflict with England escalated. On June 1st, 1812, these conflicts erupted in war. American citizens' reaction to the War of 1812 illustrated the growing diversity of the population in urban areas. Demonstrations both for and against the war swept across the states. The fighting was most intense in the Northwest Territory, an area stretching roughly from present-day Ohio to Minnesota. Peace came by treaty at the end of 1814. Though not a clear victory for either side, the U.S. government had served notice of its military prowess to all foreign powers. Though the U.S. had begun to establish an international identity, inside its borders, people still looked to define their place in society.
Political leaders were trying to define the government. At the same time, other leaders set out to make sure their followers had a place in the new nation. Some worked for new rights. Tecumseh led Native Americans in a fight to keep what they already had.
The Shawnee warrior Tecumseh was born in 1768 near what is now Springfield, Ohio. During the early republic, like many natives, Tecumseh became impatient with U.S. policies regarding Indian lands.
Native American people in Ohio and Indiana were being absolutely overwhelmed by settlers. Their lands were being taken and they were being mistreated within the justice system.
Early in his life, Tecumseh participated in many raids and battles against the American government and white settlers. But in 1809, he and his brother Tenskwatawa initiated a different type of resistance.
Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet, promises the Shawnees and other Indians a religious revitalization. If they return to the old ways, good times will return. Tecumseh then takes his brother's religious movement and politicizes it and argues that all of the land belongs to all of the Indians.
No groups among us have the right to sell, even to one another, and surely not to outsiders who want all, and will not do with less. Sell a country, why not sell the air, the clouds, and the great sea, as well as the earth?
Tecumseh convinced Indian nations from Canada to Florida to band together. He and Tenskwatawa soon established the village of Kitty-Tippecanoe, a gathering spot for warriors embracing the brothers' spiritual and political leadership. As Tecumseh traveled in 1811, appealing to tribal nations to join the resistance, U.S. soldiers attacked the village in his absence. Tenskwatawa, the great spiritual leader, could provide little defense. After a bloody battle, the Native Americans fled, and the soldiers burned the village to the ground. But Tecumseh's alliance of warriors remained resolute in the fight to protect their homeland. During the War of 1812, the British and the Indians made strange bedfellows.
Tecumseh is not so naive that he doesn't understand what the British are doing, but he needs the British logistical support. The alliance between Great Britain and Tecumseh is an alliance of convenience. The British are attempting to limit the power of the United States, but they really aren't that interested in Indian land claims. The British really use the Indians in the War of 1812.
At the Battle of the Thames in eastern Ontario, Tecumseh and the British faced likely defeat.
Tecumseh, before the battle, tells the British commander, "If you want to run, flee, but give us the guns and ammunition, because you have some place to flee, we have no place to go. We will leave our bones on the battlefield if necessary." And they do.
After firing 2 volleys, the British Army fled. Many natives died, including Tecumseh, who was shot twice in the chest.
Tecumseh leaves a profound legacy. His legacy is that Native American people must stand together against the federal government and the government of the United States.
Like Tecumseh, Richard Allen built a broad community by finding ways to address common needs. Allen, however, worked from within conventional American society to establish a place for his followers. In his youth, Allen worked as a farmhand in Delaware. Curious about rumors of a great meeting in the woods, Allen followed some field workers to a clearing where a Methodist circuit rider preached. Moved by what he witnessed, he embraced Christianity. Methodist doctrine vehemently denounced slavery, a message that profoundly affected the 17-year-old.
Once Allen was converted, he actually convinced his owner, who was not a man of faith, to allow the preacher to come and preach on the farm where Allen at that time was living. And as a result, his owner was then converted, experienced a religious conversion.
Compelled by his new spiritual convictions, Allen's owner offered him the opportunity to buy his freedom. As a freedman, Allen himself became a traveling minister and eventually accepted an invitation to preach at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. Over the next 3 years, his black following at the church grew significantly, to the discomfort of many white church members. In November of 1787, church leaders even tried to remove 2 black members of the congregation while Allen was leading a service.
The African American members of that congregation walked out.
You cannot seal up the scriptures from us and deny us a name in heaven. We believe heaven is free for all who worship in spirit and in truth.
Despite this dismal treatment, Allen refused to renounce Methodism. He began advocating for a black Methodist denomination, but met resistance from church elders. When the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 broke out in Philadelphia, Allen's followers cared for both whites and blacks, nursing the sick and burying the dead.
People who had the ability were leaving the city. No one wanted to assume the tasks that were at hand, but people of color were coming to the fore and saying, this is our opportunity to show that we are citizens, that we're concerned about our city and its safety.
Recognizing the contribution made by Allen and his followers, white Methodist elders officially sanctioned the formation of his new church.
Mother Bethel Church arose basically in a sense of protest and in a sense of affirmation of freedom.
On July 29, 1794, the Bethel Church congregation held services in a converted blacksmith shop. Allen had opened the doors to what would become known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
He is an example of courage and the ability to be a part of society and to have courage in the face of power.
The Mother Bethel AME Church still stands on the original lot in Philadelphia. It's the oldest parcel of real estate owned continuously by African Americans in the United States. When the American Revolution heralded the rights of man, some people proposed that women, too, had an important role to play in the new nation. But women of all social levels were excluded from political discourse.
Many girls learned to read just basically enough to read the Bible, to sign their names. Over the course of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, we see levels of literacy for men increasing, and we see their sisters playing catch-up.
Judith Sargent Murray, the daughter of a well-to-do Massachusetts merchant, was an influential thinker, writer, and early advocate of women's rights. As a young woman, she was tutored alongside her brother. He eventually went to Harvard, while she remained at home and wrote. Yet with her unusual level of education and sheer volume of her work, Murray would inspire countless women seeking an identity within the new society. Murray published poetry, plays, a novel, and essays. Her works addressed philosophical ideas of the early republic, including the notions of human rights and liberty.
The problem that faces women who wish to make a political intervention will be that they have to persuade men to do something that at some level is against their interests. And this is going to be very difficult.
American leaders, including George Washington and John Adams, read Murray's works, in which she advocated for more equal treatment for all women.
Is it indeed a fact that nature hath yielded to 1/2 of the human species so unquestionable a mental superiority? I know that to both sexes elevated understandings and the reverse are common.
Unlike later women who would directly confront the idea of gender inequality, Murray and her contemporaries championed a role that fit within the current social structure. Thanks in part to Murray's work, access to education became an important goal for white women. Murray and other women argued that wives and mothers needed to be cultured and well-versed in political thought in order to be proper companions and raise their children to become responsible citizens. Murray's writing advocated for women's education so convincingly that few among her influential readers could oppose it. With improved printing technology and distribution and increased social acceptance, literacy among men and women began to rise.
So you can learn to read in the absence of schools. But once you've learned to read, those energies can go into building schools. And these things happen in an interlinked way simultaneously.
Through the early 19th century, America saw the beginning of a movement to build schools specifically for young women. Murray was pleased that finally women could spend time on work of a more elevated nature than, as she put it, the use of the needle.
I take leave to congratulate my fair countrywomen on the happy revolution which the past few years has made in their favor. Female academies are everywhere establishing.
The new schools not only provided women with education, they offered professional opportunities.
Schools then are private, which means that they are entrepreneurial. And one of the few respectable ways in which a woman can earn money is to set up a school.
Judith Sargent Murray's advocacy for women's education provided an important beginning in the struggle for equal opportunities and equal legal rights for women. Richard Allen, Tecumseh, and Judith Sargent Murray came from vastly different circumstances, but each drew on those circumstances to extend the rights of others in the new nation.
U.S. leaders had rejected British rule, but they didn't want to give up European tradition. Why did the architects of the new nation go back to the styles of ancient Greece and Rome? And what message did they send?
A classical style can mean different things to different people. A classical style can be used by democratic government as well as repressive governments. The meaning of a classical style, that's what we're talking about essentially in this building. We're here in the Octagon House, and it is one of the few surviving buildings from early Washington that is still relatively intact. My name is David B. Logic, and I'm professor of art history at the George Washington University. Art history is the study of objects to determine what the objects meant for contemporaries of the period and how those meanings changed over time.
A painter or a sculptor, and even an architect, there are all kinds of unconscious decisions made. The author relies upon past tradition. There is a kind of visual language, too, that we just automatically take for granted.
I look at the building ornament and see how that is decorated, how that really advertises the social standing.
It was here that they would have talked, had played cards, and enjoyed conversation.
A revolution, of course, is a very chaotic, violent event. Coming out of that chaos, that violence, we want to reassure that this is not going to be an experiment in government that's going to disintegrate.
I mean, the use of stone for the foundation of the building, and then the use of marble, suggests that the new republic is going to be a place that has these ties to the classical past.
Exactly.
Classical style signify a kind of continuity with the ancient past, going back to the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and to reassure people that this revolutionary new government had roots in the past.
The value of classicism for the American Republic was that it suggested a certain level of stability, of order.
When you entered the Octagon, you had entered into a building that made a wonderful architectural, social, historical statement about the city of Washington.
This entranceway and the stairwell divide the building into two equal halves. It creates a kind of processional space. The doors leading to the service stairway, that door is a hidden door, so that the servants are basically to be seen as little as possible.
Whereas the elegance of the entrance stair hall is much more flowing and elliptical. This is very triangular and runs from the basement to the attic.
To have this situated in such a magnificent fashion with this brick and stone architecture suggested stability, confidence in the future of the Republic.
Architecture, of course, is something that, we live in.
It's part of our built environment that we all experience. And we all walk streets, we see buildings, we experience spaces. And so architecture is really part of the fabric of living.
L'Enfant's plans for Washington, D.C. took decades to complete. Building the new nation was also a slow process. The Constitution provided a blueprint, but over the next half-century, the structure of the nation continued to shift.
information about this and other Annenberg Media programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.
I see an old face that's gotten a little bit older.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming out tonight. I'm Sean McMinn, this year's co-chair of the 10th annual Rock the Oaks concerts. On behalf of the Thousand Oaks Youth Commission, the Civic Arts Plaza Foundation, thanks for coming out tonight to show your love for all these great bands. Now this is Matt Stein. He's going to be introducing the first band.
How's everybody doing tonight? That's great. Left on Bromley is truly a classic rock band. Some of their favorite bands include Aerosmith, Guns N' Roses, Black Sabbath, and Led Zeppelin. There are 4 talented musicians in this band. Andrew Cohen on lead and rhythm guitar, Preston Walker on rhythm guitar and lead vocals, Shay Segun on bass, and Kevin Cablefield on drums. So without further ado, Left on Bromley!
Tried to disappear, saw myself all the same. Thought the answer was crystal clear, only nobody knew my name. Watch my every move, watch my every move. Watch it go. righteous one, show me the way. If you can be so kind, if you're not blind, watch my every move. Watch my every move. Watch my every move. Watch it go. Watch it go. Watch my every move. Watch my every move. Watch my every move. Watch my every move. Watch it go. Watch my every move. Watch my every move. Watch my every move. Listen to what you say. Watch it go. Watch it go. Watch it go. Thank you so much for coming out to Rock the Oaks tonight. Got a lot of songs for you tonight. And this one coming up is called Affiliation. Nostalgia for everything I used to be. 2 cents up in your pocket, gonna give them to me. Those affiliated with this band bear a shocking resemblance to Queen Man. Take me home tonight. I don't want your money. I said I'm moving down the line. Dear Mr. William, I know would be so ashamed, playing the character wrong that you've been named. When will be the day that you shut your mouth? The day that you close the door and I get out. So take me home tonight. 'Cause I don't want your money. I said I'm moving down the line. I know you'll help me get back to a place where I'm going strong. I go too far, I know you'll get me right back to where I belong. Take me home. Awesome. The song's called 5 Years Different. I see an old face that's gotten a little bit older, and they will tell you change is natural and good for you. That's a theory that I question now more than gravity itself. That's the force that's supposed to hold your mind and pin it down onto your intentions. That 5 years later, different to you, and leave the best of yourself behind. On the screen I see a face that's too young to be where it is. And orange jumpsuits made for the children's sizes that you just couldn't seem to fit yourself into. Call it the hack, call it the bling ring, find the word. Replace the fact that you are throwing your damn life away to dogs and how they bite. That 5 years make no difference to you, and leave the best of yourself behind. This song's called Butterfly. Then came the rain, and were we ever the same? No, never the same, but there was no pain. And as we watch the sunrise, we can see your face shining down upon us from up above, and we can let you fly like a butterfly, like a butterfly. Cry, that's okay, but you're a butterfly. It's time to fly away, it's time to fly away. And can we make peace with what we no longer see? Can we let you be? Can we let you be free? Can we let you fly like a butterfly? Can we let you fly? We just finished a new song called Lucid, and we play it right now. Let me see your face. You got some purple circles in your eyes. Mary and me would make a sweet teen pair of both for price. Oh my, chains attached, a free one never to catch. Now it's your turn to exchange on a for a try. Heads crowd the ocean to go see it as I'll never be. Making a break from the surface. Would you walk through the open? Feel the house gone on the rotten dice. Oh, your hypnotized. And why don't you get in? Come with me, alright. Now it's your talking heads crowd the ocean. You see it as I let it be, making a break from the surface. Would you walk through the open? Making a break from the sunshine. Would you walk through the open gate? Lucid as I'll ever be. Lucid as I'll ever be. Couple more for you. Talk quick. Well, I'm messed up. I gotta listen to you. I'm the only reason. The one and only one. You're the only reason. The one and only one. You're quick to anger. You leave me in the dust. You leave me without thinking. Will I give up? Yeah, I'm done with damage control. I said I'm so sick and tired of you. Yeah, you've taken your soul. I'm the only reason. The one and only one. You're the only reason. The one and only thing that's causing this breakdown. 'Cause you're quick to anger. You leave me in the dust. You leave me without thinking.
right. All right, we have one more. It's called Wind Chimes. Thank you very much for coming out to see us tonight. We got Andrew Cohen on lead guitar, Shay Siegman on bass, Kevin Caldwell on drums. My name is Preston.